Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, 2 San Diegans are identified as victims in this week's attack on a U.S. consulate in Libya. And regulators call for another public hearing on the troubled San Onofre nuclear power plant.
Plus, we continue our general election coverage with a nonpartisan explanation and analysis of some of California's controversial ballot measures.
And we'll have a look at a long-running legal battle over some prime land in the middle of Mission Bay Park. KPBS Evening Edition starts now.
KPBS Evening Edition is made possible by Joan and Erwin Jacobs and by
Hello, good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dwayne Brown. 2 San Diegans have been identified as victims in Tuesday's attack on the U.S. Embassy in Libya. UT San Diego says one was 41-year-old Tyrone Woods, a former Navy SEAL from Imperial Beach. The other man was also a former SEAL. We have more on his background from our Home Post blogger, Beth Ford Roth.
His name was Glenn Doherty, and he was a 42-year-old former Navy SEAL. Doherty was a Massachusetts native who made his home in Encinitas. His family told a Boston newspaper he left the service 4 years ago and went to work for a private security firm providing security for U.S. diplomats. He was working in that job when he was killed in Libya. Doherty also worked as a trainer for SealFit Gym in Encinitas, and the gym's website said Doherty was a former triathlete who was also an accomplished pilot who earned his Bachelor of Science degree in professional aeronautics.
Tuesday's attack also killed U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens and a State Department employee. A Libyan official says heavily armed militants were behind the attack, and he says some have been arrested. The official tells the Associated Press the attack may have been timed to mark the anniversary of 9/11, but an anti-Islam film may have served as a cover. That film mocks Muslims and the Prophet Muhammad. The man believed to have made it is now in hiding in Southern California. He calls himself Sam Basile, but the Justice Department says his real name is Nakoula Basli Nakoula, and he has a criminal record. The movie is blamed for riots in Egypt and Yemen, as well as Libya. The Pentagon is sending 3 San Diego-based ships to the Middle East on Monday, the Peleliu, the Rushmore, and the Green Bay. The 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit will also deploy with them. The Navy says the sailors and Marines are fresh from 9 months of training. The agency running the state's power grid is making plans for another summer without San Onofre. The nuclear power plant in the North County has been offline since January because of problems with tubes in its steam generators. Plant operator Southern California Edison is expected to submit a plan for restarting one reactor, but it could take months for federal regulators to approve it. They've scheduled a public meeting about the plant next month. San Diego could owe a hefty amount for its pension fund next year because of turmoil in the international financial markets and because of pension reform. An early estimate shows the pension system's annual investment return is much lower than expected, and the city may need to pay as much as $10 million to cover the shortfall. At the same time, implementing a 401k system for new hires is expected to cost up to $30 million next year. The city says the savings from pension reform will kick in after 6 years. Home sales and prices went up in San Diego County last month. DataQuick says sales jumped more than 22% compared to a year ago, and the median price rose about 8%. The real estate tracking firm reports similar increases around Southern California. There's been an uptick in sales of high-end homes. The numbers are the best for August in about 6 years. The Chargers have one more day to keep their Sunday home opener from getting blacked out. The team has until 1:25 tomorrow afternoon to sell about 2,100 tickets. They're asking fans to wear white for the game against the Tennessee Titans. And before kickoff, the Chargers will honor Junior Seau one more time. They'll retire his number 55. It's an honor the team's given to only 2 other players, the 1960s-era wide receiver Lance Allworth and quarterback Dan Fouts. A longtime San Diego icon who jokingly says the Padres bear his name was given a special honor today. Father Joe Carroll spent 3 decades nurturing a public service empire to feed, house, and rehabilitate homeless people. Like the swinging friar for the San Diego Padres, Father Joe Carroll has been knocking the ball out of the park on behalf of people in need since 1982. A huge baseball fan, Father Joe claims the Padres were named after him. Of course, that's not true, but he does look a lot like the team's mascot. Last year, he stepped down from running Father Joe's Villages. It's a combination of several organizations providing meals, health care, housing, job training, and children's services, among others. At 70 and a wheelchair user because of diabetes, he's still a consummate fundraiser who says it's all about neighbors helping neighbors.
So my goal in 30 years has been, these are neighbors who have to be in trouble. When you have a neighbor who's sick, that's a neighbor. When you have a homeless person who's sick, that sounds fearful. So my goal has always been, we're neighbors helping neighbors. That's all they are, is our neighbors, and we're the neighbors to them, and we help them.
In 1987, he realized his vision of a one-stop shop approach to rehabilitation programs under one roof. The program became a national model for delivering service to homeless people.
Despite his New York accent, Father Joe's as much a part of San Diego as fish tacos and the Coronado Bridge. Father Joe came out to California in the 60s with the goal of striking it rich, but instead he ended up committing himself to God and helping the less fortunate.
At a Rotary Club luncheon, Mayor Jerry Sanders presented him with a new title.
I'm honored to present him with the Rotary Club's 2012 Mr. San Diego Award.
So what does Father Joe think about being named Mr. San Diego?
There's no check with it. No, I think it's recognition, particularly by the downtown community, that we've made a difference.
Former president of the San Diego Rotary Club, Dr. Fred Fry.
One of the reasons that St. Paul, Father Joe's Village, St. Vincent de Paul, has been such a huge success in this community. He has raised our consciousness about their mission, he has gotten into our pockets, and he has done a tremendous job for the homeless and the disadvantaged here in the community.
Father Joe Carroll becomes the 60th person honored with the title of Mr. or Miss San Diego since it started in 1952. We continue our November election coverage with a closer look at a few state ballot measures. Peggy Pico explains how they could impact San Diego.
Come November, voters throughout California will decide on a handful of propositions that include taxes for public safety and education, plus revisions on the three strikes law, repeal of the death penalty, and labeling of genetically engineered foods. To help sort through these measures and explain what might happen if they pass or fail are my guest Carl Luna, professor of political science at Mesa College, and Thad Kauser, professor of political science at UC San Diego. Let's start with Proposition 30, Governor Brown's tax initiative. This is actually, Thad, a constitutional amendment, and some say it's two taxes rolled into one. Explain it for us.
Yeah, it does two things. The first one affects all of us. It's going to raise sales tax for the next 4 years by a quarter of a penny for every dollar that we spend in California. It's small, but it does affect all of us. The second one is the so-called millionaire's tax. It actually kicks in if you may on incomes over $250,000 for a single person or $500,000 a year for a family, and then you have a 1% increase in your income tax, and then if you get more money, it's a 2%, and then finally for incomes over $1 million for a family, it's a 3% increase. So there's a little bit of the kind of occupy, reduce the income inequality in California to bring in $6 billion a year in new taxes.
Before we move on to what the tax actually pays for, it's called a temporary tax. And my question to you is, are there such things as temporary taxes, and why does anybody think that our economy will be better in 7 years?
Well, the economy is going to go up and down, but we've had temporary taxes at the worst part of the recession that actually expired, and voters said no to an increase of them. Now, political logic would dictate it's easier to go back to voters to extend a temporary tax increase, but Sacramento would still have to come back to voters or get a 2/3 vote of both houses in Sacramento to extend this once these things expire in 4 and 7 years.
Okay, so a little safety net there. Carl, this is supposed to increase the governor's tax initiative. Prop 30 is supposed to increase revenue by about $6 billion a year in California. Where's that money going?
The bulk of it's going to education, and of that, the bulk's going to K through 12 education, with some money then going to post-secondary, the UCs, the state system and all. And then some money goes to law enforcement, to public safety initiatives. They kind of spread a little bit of money around to every constituency to try to maximize voter support for the entirety of it.
What happens if the schools and those services, public safety services, don't get this money? What if it doesn't pass?
Well, you've heard of the fiscal cliff in Washington. We've got like the fiscal crevasse here in California. The schools have been reducing budgets for the last 10 years for the most part. There's not a lot of fat left in their budgets to cut through. If you don't pass this, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in mid-year reductions this year alone for school districts. The UC systems, which are pretty much privatized anyway, they get very little money now from the state, get even less. Tuitions go up. Law enforcement, municipalities will have to struggle to find money to cover monies they otherwise wouldn't have to keep cops on the beat.
And that's not the only choice voters have. Proposition 38 when it comes to taxes, a little bit confusing. A similar tax, Molly Munger's tax. Thad, tell us about how it differs from the governor's tax initiative.
Well, this tax is bigger. It's $10 billion instead of $6 billion a year. It's spread more widely, so everyone pays more income tax under the Molly Munger proposal, Prop 38, with the idea that, we all enjoy the schools, we should all pay for them. And finally, all the money, all $10 billion a year, is locked into schools. Can't go for other budget balancing and law enforcement provisions. It's directly to the classrooms.
All right. What happens if, and I'll this up to both of you, what do you think will happen if both of them pass?
The one with the most votes goes into effect.
That's right. And what I meant to ask, the one with the most votes goes into effect. What happens if they both fail?
If they both fail, then the state will be scrambling, municipalities will be scrambling for money, and you'll feel pain this year and probably even more pain next year in terms of reduced services and reduced programs in the schools and teacher layoffs.
Okay, let's go back to public safety. Proposition 36, another proposition on the ballot, asks voters to revise the repeat offenders or the 3 strikes law. Thad, why is this on the ballot, do you think, right now?
Well, this ballot measure is written with dollars and cents in mind and trying to make an economic appeal to voters and trying to capture the budget crisis we have as the reason for making an amendment that opponents of 3 strikes have wanted to make since day one, since it was first passed in the 90s, which is to say that that last strike that puts you away for 25 years to life has to be a serious or violent felony. It has to be something not just a property crime or a drug crime, which is now more than half of the third strikers are put away for a third strike, which is not a serious or violent felony. So although they've committed a serious or violent felony in the past.
So it could strengthen the 3 strikes law. But my question for Carl, do you think this is financially motivated more than trying to change the law?
It's a combination of both. The federal government has put a gun to the head of California to drop down its prison populations. The state can't afford as much as it's been spending on prisons to begin with. The idea of the 3 strikes revision would be to go to people that are in prison, have a chance to sort through some of the people that mentioned maybe shouldn't be in for a long-term sentence, and get them released out, change the number that are going in, and thereby achieve a social justice good and a fiscal good. The downside, law and order proponents say, better to get a guy with a 3rd strike before he goes back out to be a recidivist and send crime rates up. Now, crime rates are almost at historical lows or at them, so the voters may not be feeling as fearful, and that may be one of the reasons why you picked this as a time to do this measure.
Carl, it's also related to Prop 34, another state proposition which seeks to repeal the death penalty. Do you think for similar reasons?
The repeal of the death penalty is presented on a fiscal argument, and it is true. You pay a premium to execute. A lot of people think that it's cheaper to execute than not. You'd save $110 million or more dollars a year if you simply incarcerate for life. That being said, it's also a social justice issue. You don't put a price tag on justice. A large portion of the population supports the death penalty, and that being the case, the polls I've seen shows this one trailing.
725 death row inmates in California. Would this be retroactive if it passes?
Yes, it would. It would convert all those sentences to life without possibility of parole.
Okay. We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I want to get to State Proposition 37, which requires labeling of genetically engineered food or genetically modified food. Thad, let's start with you. What would have to change on the labels?
Well, it's going to have to say that it was genetically engineered, or with some products, there's a possibility that genetically engineered food would come in, and this applies to everything from produce to canned goods, except for it exempts a few things. It exempts alcohol and it exempts organic foods. So we can still have our our Chardonnay and our organic brie in California without this, but everything else we'd see an almost cigarette label-like warning telling us that look, this is Frankenstein corn, these beans were genetically engineered, and it doesn't take a stand on whether that's good or not, but it lets consumers know.
And just to be clear, organic food can be genetically engineered, so it wouldn't have to be labeled.
Yeah, that's one of the exemptions.
So there's an exclusion, absolutely an exclusion. Carl, who's going to pay for this?
Oh, we all are. I mean, there's going to be a few million for the state to implement this. The producers argue it's going to increase food costs. Not a lot, but you have to relabel everything. But the bigger impact is going to be that people see that label and they will simply assume it's something like a tobacco label. It makes the food seem less attractive, and they may want to move to another alternative. Problem is, there aren't that many other alternatives. You may just have to put a big genetically modified label right in the front of every supermarket, because a lot of the food in there, if not most, has been genetically modified now.
All right, a lot to talk about on that. We are out of time, but there's a lot more of you, both of you, talking on our website today about these state propositions and some local propositions as well. Carl Luna, Thad Kauser, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
For years, San Diego City Parks Department has been trying to reclaim 76 acres in the middle of Mission Bay Park. It's a mobile home park called De Anza Cove. A court ruling expected early next year may determine how the land will be turned back to the city. But KPBS reporter Tom Fudge says it's not clear when the legal fight over De Anza Cove will end.
Seeing the sun sparkle on the water is familiar to those who have visited Mission Bay, and it's also the view you get from the mobile home of Ernie Abbott, who told me what he likes about living at the De Anza Cove Mobile Home Park.
Everything, absolutely everything. It's peaceful, it's beautiful, it's quiet, it's the kind of neighborhood that you want to be in. I always liked the waterfront.
But Abbott and his neighbors, who now occupy more than 300 mobile homes, aren't supposed to be here. Their lease expired in 2003. Ever since then, they've been in a legal tangle with the city of San Diego, which is trying to remove them. Scott Shipman is a Mission Bay community activist. He says the mobile home residents are living on prime real estate, which belongs not to them, but to all of San Diego.
The important point here is that the rights of the citizens of San Diego and the region are being denied to use the Mission Bay Park the way it was intended to be used, because we've got people who have permanent housing on tidelands and on Mission Bay Park property.
Most of the residents of De Anza Cove are elderly, and they're paying rents that are far below the commercial rates you'd expect of waterfront property. Despite the many disputes in this case, one fact is undeniable. Residents of the mobile home park had known for years that their leases would end in 2003. William Rathbone, a private attorney representing the city, says the plan to terminate the lease was spelled out in a long-term rental agreement established in the 1980s.
And every resident who entered the park after that signed a document indicating that they agreed with that provision.
But Ernie Abbott, who serves as the head of the De Anza Cove Homeowners Association, says residents of De Anza Cove have limited options as to where they can move. He also says the city has used bullying tactics and it has not met its obligation to homeowners.
Had we been treated justly and properly, we would have left, and there wouldn't have been any problem.
5 years ago, a district court judge upheld the lease expiration, but he also ruled the city could not evict De Anza residents on the basis of their rental agreement. He said state law governing mobile homes must determine how much money in the form of relocation benefits the residents are entitled to. What those benefits will be is a remaining question. Assuming De Anza Cove is turned back to the city's park system, there is one other question. What will the city do with it? They could turn it back into green space and playgrounds, or will the city try to lease the land to a resort hotel like this one, the Mission Bay Hilton? In fact, this was the goal of the city throughout much of the 80s and 90s. Bill Gelfand, the former manager of the De Anza Cove Mobile Home Park, says the city's desire to develop a hotel goes back further than that.
Yes, when we purchased the lease in 1969, right off the bat, they told us that they wanted the property converted to hotels.
But there's not a lot of talk of building hotels these days. Gelfand says recessions have put a damper on hotel financing, and the limited leases that are allowed on California tidelands discourage hoteliers from building on the land. One man with another plan is Scott Shipman. He has spoken with at least 2 city council members about converting De Anza Cove into what he calls an educational, environmental, recreational joint-use project. It would involve expanding green space on the shores of De Anza Cove and moving a nearby campsite called Campland across Rose Creek to the De Anza Cove property. The plan would then turn Campland into an expanded marsh and bird sanctuary. But Chipman points out his plan, or any other, depends on getting the legal mess taken care of.
The city has an obligation to settle this as soon as possible.
City Councilman Kevin Faulkner, a former chairman of the Mission Bay Park Committee, says he agrees.
Every year that litigation continues is another year that property is not open for the public. And that's what that property needs to be, open for the public.
Lawyers in the case say early next year the judge will render a ruling that spells out the relocation benefits for the residents of De Anza Cove. But the city and the mobile home owners are $50 million apart in what they want those benefits to amount to. Ernie Abbott says if mobile homeowners think the judge's decision shortchanges them, they will consider filing an appeal.
If you appeal, I mean, this could go on for years to come.
It could.
And that's okay with you?
That's fine with me. I will stay here as long as I have to and want to, and I do want to.
So there's no telling when the legal process will loosen its grip on De Anza Cove.
In tonight's Public Square, we've already got feedback about the ongoing legal scuffle over mobile homes at De Anza Cove in Mission Bay. How much are current rents? What would market rate rents be? Asked Jess Kidden on our website. KPBS reporter Tom Fudge responded by saying a one-bedroom in San Diego usually rents from about $700 to $1,400 a month. But he added, I think anyone would agree waterfront and near waterfront property in San Diego would typically go for more than that. The user SB Cabello posted his concerns. The land at De Anza clearly does not belong to the mobile home residents. It belongs to all of the residents in the city. You can join in on this conversation or comment on other KPBS news stories by following us on Twitter, liking us on Facebook, or email us at publicsquare@kpbs.org.
Recapping tonight's top stories, 2 San Diegans were killed in the Tuesday attack on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, Libya. Both were former Navy SEALs. One is identified as 41-year-old Tyrone Woods of Imperial Beach. The other was 42-year-old Glenn Doherty of Encinitas. Both were working for a private security firm. And California's power grid managers say they're making plans for another summer without the San Onofre nuclear plant. It's been shut down since January because of equipment problems. Federal regulators will hold a public meeting about the plant next month. And you can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. The PBS NewsHour is coming up next. Thanks for joining us. You have a great night.